Right, in order to begin this debate and start this motion, I need to make a couple of key definitions. So firstly, what is protest art? We consider protest art to be any form of art medium that is making a political statement typically aimed at a current establishment or similar power, like the government or like any other major power in relation to the art. And again, we consider it to be any medium, so this is not just limited to visual art. It would also extend, like visual physical art, it would also extend to things like films, music, and any other kind of art form you can think of. In terms of anonymous, what it means to be anonymous. So this means that the identity of the artist is not known, right? You don't know where they live, you don't know any characteristics about them, and you don't know their real name. Based on this, we would consider someone like Banksy to be anonymous, because even though he has the name Banksy, we only call him that because we actually don't know his real name. I don't even know if we have proof that it is a man. We don't know like anything about him. He could be a group of people for all we know. So we think it is fair to consider someone like Banksy anonymous in this debate. I hope that everyone else is okay with that framing. So going on to why protest art matters. Protest art, we believe, is most important in authoritarian countries and territories. This is because in these countries, there is often no other way to protest, right? In the UK, which has its problems, definitely, when it comes to protest, but we are legally able to protest. I can go on a rally, and theoretically, I cannot get arrested just for being in a part of that rally, right? I'm exercising my right to protest. There are many countries in the world where sadly this isn't the case, and even milder forms of criticism of the government can land you in like very bad trouble and potentially even fatal. Yeah?
So to clarify, you're saying that on your side of the house, we don't know any of the characteristics of the person creating the art?
Yeah, I would say that goes along with being anonymous, unless for some reason, like, yeah, that would be it. So yeah, we believe that protest art is most important in authoritarian countries and territories, partly because they're being like oppressed by their governments already, but also because this might actually be a lifeline for them. It's the only way to get the messages out. So that is going to inform the way we discuss the importance of being anonymous. So why do we believe that protest art should be anonymous? This is because it ties the art to the cause and the groups that are suffering due to the issue of discussion, rather than an individual, right? So, for example, let's take one of Banksy's paintings. In the West Bank, the Palestinian West Bank, there is a Banksy of a dove covered with a military jacket. A dove is obviously a symbol of peace, so this is clearly making a comment about the kind of fake peace that currently exists in the two-state, obviously very deliberately in the West Bank to like protest this. Because we don't know anything about, we don't know if Banksy is Israeli, we don't know if he's Palestinian, we don't know if he's Jewish, we don't know any of these identifying features, so no one can kind of discredit the art based on any of these. Like, it forces you to just take the art of what it is and focus on what it says, which is that Palestinians are not experiencing peace. It was there before the conflict that's currently going on. At that time, it was commenting on the fact that the supposed peace that existed in the current situation is not peace. It is being inflicted with military violence. And that is what, it is focused on the Palestinians, because we cannot make any judgments in it based on the individual, right? Often when individuals make art, protest art or not art, actually particularly in protest art, people can make comments about them. You know, like say if you've come up with a feminist art piece, people can be like, well, that's a rich woman that made that if they know who it is, so why should we be listening to her about feminism? She's really privileged. You know what I mean? It can become less about the art. And equally, someone might dislike the person and then they no longer credit the protest art, and that stops the conversation happening because we're getting too focused on what we think of the artist. What anonymity does is it separates the art from the artist. Another good thing about this is a problem with all art generally is that unfortunately there have been many artists, again we're thinking of all mediums here, that have done something unethical to the point where people consider it unethical to consume, discuss and praise their art, right? Some examples here would be like Andy Warhol, I don't know, like Kevin Spacey, that's like one of the only ones that can come to my head right now. Like this isn't protest art, but it's an issue across art in that, no, not yet. This is a problem across all art, that people do unethical actions and then people feel unable to engage with the work. This is a big problem if it comes to protest art, because it's not just like not being able to watch your favourite film or stream your favourite artist. It's like now we cannot have a conversation about this, and now people are not going to be able to rally behind this anymore. So this can happen in any form of art, but it's particularly important in protest art. POI?
Perhaps anonymity helps us appreciate better Banksy's art, but it also prevents us from fully appreciating the art of, for example, a Palestinian artist who has lived experiences. Why do you value the former over the latter?
Because unfortunately, people are very dismissive of Palestinians' voices because Palestinians, you know, they have spoken up for themselves. They have spoken up about the crisis going on, but people dismiss them. People, like, you know, people will just automatically say that they have links to Hamas, whether or not they do. These kind of horrible statements are made to immediately try and defame these people. And this is because, as well, if we go back to the authoritarian countries, these countries are going to, you know, they tend to be, they don't have a free press, right? Their government produces more like propaganda than news because they don't have a free press. So it's much more likely that they're going to try and do like defamations. No one can defame like Banksy as being like a violent Palestinian, as being like a Hamas agent, because we don't have no idea if he even is Palestinian, right? So yeah, I think the lived experience of Palestinians is important to hear, but the artwork will have a wider reach, unfortunately, if it's anonymous. This might not be the most just in terms of them expressing themselves, but will get the most people to talk about the art and support the art and talk about the cause, which we believe is the most important issue here. That is the biggest impact, is the art changing things. And we do know that art, I just want to explain, art can change things. The song Heroes by David Bowie was literally, he received an award for that song, having a role in the breaking down of the Berlin Wall. So I just want to make it absolutely clear that when we're talking about the impacts of art, this is literally it is life or death. It does have the capability to change things. So that is why it is so important. The integrity of it is maintained, which we believe can only be on our side of the house. My partner will come up in a minute and will explain how this is more particularly important in authoritarian countries, which I've already started. He will finish that argument.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now invite the Leader of the Opposition to commence the case vote. And just to double check, you did not consent to being...
Thank you. So I'm going to be continuing my Prime Minister's speech about why we prefer protest art to be anonymous. And I'm going to couch it in a current sort of context of the way the world is right now, the way that technology exists right now, and the way that art is being propagated because of this technology. Ultimately, that means that anonymous art is far superior, is far preferable to art that is tied to a particular artist that is known, that has known characteristics, a known name, etc. Okay, so I think in this debate, as my Prime Minister said, the most important people are the people living in oppressive regimes. Now, we've been talking a lot about Palestine, which is obviously an incredibly important area. However, this is quite a unique situation in that it is a country that is being oppressed by Israel, which is supported in full by Western governments who are democratically accountable. This is fairly unique in that most people who live under oppressive regimes live in countries like China or Russia or many other countries around the world who are not subject to Western democratic pressure. So in order for these people to relieve themselves of that oppression, that needs to come from within. Okay, we know from what is going on in the Middle East right now, from what has happened in the past, that it is not very possible for the democratic Western countries to simply free these people of their oppression, right? So this has to come from within. So what we're talking about really is these artists growing themselves within their own countries, growing support, and ultimately building support for some kind of movement that can eventually relieve relieve the oppression from these countries, right? Now, opposition might say, well, how do we know this is going to happen? How do we know that art has the power to do this, right? I would say, how do we know that any protest art works, right? Even in the West, do we really have many examples of protest art actually achieving success, even in democratic countries? I'm not sure. I can't really think of many examples, right? So I think that they need to prove specifically why this won't happen in these, why this is impossible to happen, but it might happen where there is less of this oppressive apparatus. Okay. So these days, Authoritarian regimes have access to like massively oppressive surveillance technology because like AI enables for like thousands and thousands of times more data to be processed quickly. So it allows them to surveil their people much more rapidly in terms of so they can tie people's personal characteristics to their internet behavior, where they go physically. So if they know anything about you, they can basically track your entire life and surveil you completely. Yeah.
In the most oppressed and subjugated context where individuals face numerous barriers towards emancipation, why is protest art the tipping point?
I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying it is one of the tipping points. It can be a tipping point. There's no reason to believe that it can't be a tipping point. If you are able to spread a message of a certain message across your entire country, which which I will explain, art is the best method to do so. Art is the best method to spread a emancipatory message across your country. Then that is, as far as I can see, you're going to have to prove why there is a better avenue for these people to do that than art, ultimately. Okay, so this technology allows for this surveillance, right? So this means that if you expose your identity or any of your individual characteristics, it's very easy for this government to track you down and stop you, imprison you, or kill you, or like blow you up, right? We have the example of going back to Palestine, right? The people that made that documentary that won the Oscar, literally, like I'm pretty sure one of those guys literally got like murdered, right? That probably would have been harder to do if he was anonymous. The message would have fundamentally stayed the same, but it might have been slightly less powerful. But I think on our side of the house, it might have been that individual story might have been slightly less powerful because the story wasn't attached. But on our side of the house, we're going to get far more of this art created because people are not going to be scared that they're going to get murdered, right? So imagine how more likely you are to be to publish art if that art to publish art anonymously than you are under your own name. If you know, because again, we've got examples of it, you know under this technological context, you're far more likely to be arrested or like imprisoned or killed. You are far more likely, you are probably you're many magnitudes more likely to be an artist anonymously than not anonymously, right? So even if you might have one individual story of a like person who has this story whose identity does like amplify the power of that art, we have so much more art on our side of the house anonymously that the total sum total of like effect on the population is far higher on our side of the house. Again, because because the situation is so bad now that people know that the consequences will be so bad if they expose themselves that we're going to have far more artists on our side of the house. Okay. So technology also allows for the propagation of art. Like people can become an artists anonymously on the internet, right? There is widespread access to like VPNs even in a lot of these like very oppressive countries, right? So people can spread like songs or visual art or like films and through these means, and they can propagate amongst the population widely, right? And if this is done anonymously, and this can be done anonymously. So this art can be incredibly effective and incredibly widespread, even if it is anonymous, right? Also, like traditionally, people love like a mystery. There is an intrigue to the idea that people don't know who it is, right? And people, people want to find out, and that builds up extra momentum towards the spread of the arts, right? Also, if people don't know any characteristics, it allows them to project themselves onto the artist. It allows them to see themselves in. The message is ultimately more inspirational. Art is up for interpretation. Ultimately, if I don't know anything about the artist, I might be able to see myself in that art more so than if I knew about the artist and I perhaps knew that they had something about them that I wasn't a fan of, right? The art speaks for itself, and again, is more generally effective, right? So also I talked about like AI is far more. It's now far easier to defame an artist because of like AI. You can make like a fake video of them doing something. This was not the case in the past where like we believed like video evidence or audio evidence. This is no longer the case. We can't like believe it, right? So it's far easier for governments to crack down on artists who are known by using this technology, right? This isn't possible when they're anonymous and people there's like no characteristics that can be tied to them.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now invite Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close the
if everyone is ready, my time will start now. So I'm going to start with a few rebuttals, and within the rebuttals, I will also add our own extensions furthering on Nikita's case. So first of all, I think it's important to reiterate that protest art is testimonial, and we believe that we have two impacts to this. First of all, it matters where art comes from. It may be from a factory worker, or a farmer, or a woman of color, or etc. Protest art cannot be political if the message is separated from the messenger. It matters who is putting the art out, because their lived experiences influence how heavy we weigh their art. And it will ultimately carry a much larger impact, as per the examples that Nikita has already offered you. OG says that anonymous art should reflect a group and not just individuals. But individuals are inherently tied to their groups of identity. You cannot remove an individual from their group. You cannot be a white woman without still experiencing the suppression of women ultimately. And that is why protest art is not inherently separable from the artist, because it is meant to carry influential political sway. The ultimate goal of protest art is so that it is able to influence and change something in the political sphere. I'll take your PUI, yeah?
Even if what you're saying is true, is this worth risking the lives of the artists themselves?
I think safety is another point that we will touch on, and especially regarding the vulnerable stakeholders in your case, which are people in authoritarian countries. I'll touch on this in a bit later in my case. So because protest art is meant to carry influential political sway, and as social beings, it matters to us who we think we are hearing these messages from. Anonymous protests, and as a result, anonymous protests will lose credibility, and the public will gain cynicism if all protest art is done anonymously. This is because anyone can submit anything online, and as a result, protest art ultimately will start to carry less weight. And because they can arise anywhere and anyhow, this takes away from the baseline goals of protest in the first place. And this is why we also dislike AI art. Because we know the source of creation behind the art is not a person with an identity or a lived experience. And if we separate the message from the messenger in protest art as well, we're inherently doing a similar thing, wherein we do not know the lived experiences of someone who created this art. We do not know the identity of someone behind this art. This is inherently similar to how we view AI art. We don't think that there is a soul behind these messages because we cannot see it. And as sad as that is, it is ultimately true, because when you cannot see how deeply something is impacting someone, you cannot hear the messages behind their art. And next, I want to talk about the infantilization of marginalized groups that we think will arise if we make all protest art anonymous. So the largest and most influential protests are ultimately never done anonymously. Anonymous protest art silences the marginalized groups by taking away their core identity, which is the identity under which they are protesting with. I think it would be wonderful, ultimately, if people in the autocratic suppressed countries could spread their art anonymously and still achieve the level of political sway that they need to. However, humans are just drawn to real shocking stories that they can tangibly actually see who is impacted behind it. And there's just no way for protest art to actually achieve what they're meant to if they are done anonymously. But that is also taking OG's case at their best and assuming that their most vulnerable stakeholders can somehow remain anonymous. I would like to caveat this by saying that anonymity will be impossible in authoritarian regimes. You cannot hide from China and Russia. And VPN is not that effective, guys. I've used the VPN that I pay like £2.8 for every month for like 8 years in China since I was 12. Trust me when I say that the Chinese government knows they absolutely know that a 12-year-old just downloaded a VPN and is using it every single fucking month to access Instagram and YouTube. This, just because they turned a blind eye to that does not mean that I bypassed the Chinese firewall with my hacking abilities at the ripe age of 12. And ultimately, they do have a serious issue with this anonymous art, because OG's case is based on the fact that the people who create these art in suppressed environments, they will face danger. They will face life-threatening danger, right? And because there is no way for them to remain anonymous under such conditions anyway, they will find you and kidnap you and possibly kill you. But however, if you don't publish it anonymously, being famous actually protects you in this case. because the government understands the kind of backlash they will receive when a public figure is protesting publicly and people understand who this person is, where they are, and it just goes, it's the same thing as like journalists now that we see on Instagram who are doing, let me just finish a sentence, who are doing journalism in Palestine. They make it absolutely clear when they post their videos that A, they are not suicidal, that B, they do intend to continue to stay on this platform. And this sort of publicity, showing their face online, is ultimately a message to the government that they will face accountability if anything were to be done to them. Yeah, I'll take your PY.
I think we've seen with the example of the Palestinian filmmaker and also like the amount of impunity that these governments have now. They will just kill you. They don't care about the backlash because they have so much power over the narrative, over the communication networks that they can literally do anything they want. They don't care about the backlash because they can control it.
Yeah.
I think the backlash ultimately from the backlash that they will receive, whether or not they care about it, will ultimately still influence how they're being perceived. And as a result, because that changes their perception, it does hold some form of political sway. And so moving on from that, because being famous does protect you to some extent, there will be some kind of uprising if you are able to reach a certain level of publicity. We believe that this flips OG's case entirely based on their most vulnerable stakeholders because A, it proves that those vulnerable stakeholders in OG's case are not in fact able to stay anonymous, but also B, if they were to go public, they will be able to face at least more scrutiny from the public than if they tried to stay anonymous. Because if they tried to stay anonymous, and in the POI that OG offered me, if they will be killed anyway, then why not have some, then they might as well have some publicity in order for the media to provide some sort of backlash and accountability towards these governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of the Opposition, for that fine speech. And now invite the government member to commence the closing half. Here.
Panel, you should judge this debate based on what side of the House is able to fulfill the purpose of protest art better. I'll do three things in this speech. I'll explain to you what that means. I'll explain to you why anonymity protects individuals from social backlash as opposed to the analogous "the state will kill you" that OG explains. And then I'll explain how anonymity increases the scale of relatability, so how more people can engage with each individual piece of art. It affects a larger, wider people, and more people feel relatable. But first of all, what makes a piece of protest art impactful? I have three descriptions for this. First, it is the immediacy, right? It is the accessibility of an art, something that everyone can understand, the universality, and something people can opt into regardless of their cultural language barrier, stuff like that. They feel it. Secondarily, is the viscerality of things, right? Something that conveys intense feelings, like you feel disgust, you feel shock, you feel cathartic, you feel joy, you feel anger. Here are strong feelings you feel. And finally, relatability. You see how your struggles are encapsulated in individual pieces of art, and that in and of itself brings its meaning. Because the purpose of protest art is threefold. First of all, it is the fact that you feel heard when you interact with these pieces of art, or when you create these pieces of art, but most people are the ones that interact with them. Secondarily, for people who are structurally locked out, when oppression is being ignored, it is a unique tool and platform to educate all the other people. You feel like your suffering can be told, and other people are now aware of your suffering uniquely because of the protest art. And third of all, it is a counterbalancing tool because, as teams concede, states have huge oppressive powers for a bunch of other reasons. This is a unique tool to go against the state. The final thing is that this is a low barrier to entry component. Like when art pieces especially are prioritized over the reputation of like protest artists, like Banksy specifically makes pen pieces of artists that encapsulate struggle, so we ought to prioritize looking at Banksy. This is a unique pieces of art that only like is more meritocratic in the first place. But the first argument here is relatively simple. But the anonymity protects individuals from social backlash. This is unique from our opening because OG's extent extends to artists being ignored because of their cultural background and an analogous state surveillance thing, which is fairly uncomparative because the state probably has 100 other reasons to like kill you. I'm from Hong Kong. I know how it feels like. But I think the more likely proximate and comparative argument is the judgment from other people in your lives. The judgment from people like your family, the fear implicitly of ostracization. Because even if everyone in the world has the same struggle, it feels like you feel alone with your struggle and you fear being able to express yourself and being vulnerable. And secondarily, it's just in places like different regions riddled with conflict, there is inherently going to be differing opinions, which means putting your political perspective out there inherently is going to be dangerous, not because the state cracks down on you, but you fear backlash from the social circle or people from different cultural backgrounds that disagree with you on these opinions and things like that. There are 3 positive benefits to the artists and to the art pieces that are constructed. The first component is the artist can become more vulnerable and become more honest. I have 2 reasons for this. First of all, behind a veil of anonymity, you're able to sidestep social embarrassment, so you're more likely to be able to be more vulnerable. You're able to not think that, you're shameful of these circumstances, be afraid of judgment from your family because you were hurt or you were attacked or you faced experiences that you're too shameful to express. And the second component is there is no consistent long-term reputation. Political art itself can be very dangerous because maybe your career will be impeded. Maybe you do art as a hobby because you have to pursue other different components. You limit yourself and constrains your ability to self-express if you're not anonymous in the first place. The second idea is there's an increased ability to engage in riskier or audacious art. So it isn't just the artists themselves, but the type of art they construct uniquely become more empowered when it's anonymous, right? This looks like things like destructive art, like defacing specifically like statues that showcase symbols of oppression, which are hugely offensive to certain other communities, but deeply cathartic to your community because these individuals that are in the statues are ones that are hugely oppressive and hugely harmful. Uniquely, you can engage in riskier and new things that may have reputational backlash that you can sidestep when it's anonymous. And third of all, there is just a greater variety on the number of artists because you no longer need previous reputation to be heard. You no longer need a background of graduating in UAL with first-class honors or graduating from the most amazing school in the world to get respected. This is a purely meritocratic scale in which an art piece makes you visceral. An art piece makes you feel a certain way, and that in and of itself is the only way we characterize and care about this. The bottom line of this is that we get a variety of more different artists, which obviously have more different experiences, which obviously allow for more people to get all these benefits of the purpose of art. They feel more cathartic, more people get educated, it's more counterbalancing. But secondarily, there is a more audacious system with more different artists creating more different tools. So if art in and of itself is meant to self-express and allow for other people to co-opt and understand how they feel through this piece of art, where there's a greater variety of differences, it allows for more people to feel heard, more people to be educated. Before I talk about how it increases the scale of relatability, opening?
Yeah. If an anonymous person commits a highly destructive art approach, as you described they might do, how would the state not just immediately call them a terrorist if they don't have like a persona to relate that to?
Yeah, but people can be called terrorists for a bunch of different ways. But the problem is, if an art in and of itself is cathartic to a community, the state labeling them as a terrorist doesn't render catharsis and education null. They are still feelings of representation, irregardless of whether the state goes, no, 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 that is a bad thing. The second argument I'm explaining is how anonymity increases the scale of relatability and you're allowed to be more communally dispersed. The first idea here is you're able to co-opt individuals' inner protagonism, right? Because the ops case inherently concedes a need of like a cultural background in order to co-opt and understand how art works. But this inherently excludes people outside of your community. It inherently necessitates you have to have shared living experience for you to opt into it. But the problem here is struggle is often universal, right? And with art, by by itself. The viscerality and the relatability is purely from the interpretation. Maybe it's an abstract piece of art in which the community applies to both everyone in the world that feels like they're lonely, that feels like they're isolated. But if it's, for example, like a woman artist and things like that, it often excludes it because only women can relate with it in the first place. Secondarily, the idea of an encapsulation of a no-named victim is uniquely empowering. Right? You no longer feel like these pieces of art can only be constructed by artists and individuals that are talented, but you yourself are amongst the crowd. You yourself are a member of the community that struggles and suffers because you are the no-name protagonist in every single piece of art because there is no label, there's no artist in mind. Finally, there's not tied to individuals, means collectives can individually co-opt these pieces of art at a stronger way, right? When it's not a singular artist, individuals as a group collectively feel more represented by art, and a collective create this art together, which means that the groups as a community are able to co-opt this and express this art uniquely as their platform as opposed to an individual's construction. Thank you.
I thank the government members that fine speech, and now invite the opposition member to continue the debate.
Cool. Is the panel ready? I think one of the most powerful pieces of art ever created was by Marina Abramović, who used performance art to show how society treats women when they are allowed to do so. We're going to be the first team that actually shows you a very specific type of art, which is erased under their side of the house. But before that, two pieces of framing. One, I think it's important when we talk about who actually makes this kind of art to note that this is never going to be the most discriminated people. When bombs are flying, you're not like painting paintings. I think this group is kind of irrelevant and out of the debate. But then secondly, I just want to point out that protest art isn't always good protest art. People protest for pretty shit things. People protest for very, very right-wing movements. People, like neo-Nazis, paint swastikas in specific places. This is not specifically saying that this is something that is super, super common to happen, but I think that you have to have a bigger push on explaining why it is worth the trade-off to not actually be able to hold these people accountable, and why this is the benefit you get to people who can now do whatever they want is actually big enough to show that we might not be able to hold some people accountable who genuinely protest for bad things. But I think then, the very important thing here is to point out that I think because of the fact that protest art is usually by nature quite targeted. It is not always going to appeal to everyone. I'm unsure why I need to buy into this fact that everybody needs to relate to protest art. I think inherently issues that really, really affect people intensely are usually not applicable to the entire population. That is to say, if for example, a woman of color makes some art about how deeply her being a woman influenced her life, that does not have to be the most relatable thing in the world to Boon. I think that's fine. So what are we going to do in our debate? Two things. I think one, I'm going to prove to you that art in and of itself on their side of the house is bad because it's unengaging and it is tokenistic when you don't have identity as a part of it. But secondly, I'm going to explain why specifically performance art is the best type of art when we are doing protest art and why it is so bad that we lose this. So then first let's talk about why you actually need identity for good art. I think OG concedes that you won't know their characteristics when we specifically POI this, right? At this point we have to accept this as part of the debate. I think we then take a much lower burden than our opening, right? Because we show that the art itself cannot be good and cannot be engaging without identity, and we don't require the victims to become massive advocates for their cause because we understand that I think Gov is correct to point out that it's probably something that's quite difficult, probably something that might even be dangerous for them to do. So the thing that we just want to point out is that identity in and of itself is what makes the art emotionally engaging to the people who then actually engage with it. I think the first thing to point out here is what do our minds tend to without identity? Because when you tell me that people in and of themselves are quite biased, I think what this then means is that when you aren't actually told about the identity of a person, you just default to your own shitty biased perception of that person, right? That is to say that when somebody sees a perception of some Palestinian girl suffering, your mind doesn't go to the nuanced case of, this girl is probably this really complex educated woman. If you yourself already have ingrained biases and now you're interpreting something abstract without actually knowing anything about this person, I think the most likely interpretation is that you probably tend to quite a problematic understanding of this person, and we think then this is something that is quite bad. But how does this then look on our side of the house? I think I want to point out a very important nuance, because I think that you can still have this individual reflection that they talk about. imagine you go into a museum, right? You're looking at the art, let's say it's visual art. You usually look at the painting before you look at the plaque, right? I think that there is quite a lot of scope for you to engage with the art without knowing that person's identity, right? After that, you look at the identity and then you can reflect on this. You can have further thought processes, but it's not actually mutually exclusive that I have that period of time where I am in fact engaging with that art first without actually knowing the identity of this person. I think usually this comes secondary to me engaging with that piece of art in the first place. So I think that this is if they want to claim this is a positive impact, I think this is something that we are able to then also co-opt. But I think that the nuance here becomes very important. I think when we have a nuanced understanding of the person that creates that art, we are much likely to A, empathize with that person and see them as human, but 2, we are much more likely to think that the cause that they care about is much more proximate to us. What does this mean? For example, I may think that I don't share much with a Palestinian girl. I may think that this can never happen to me. But if I read her bio and I find out that before the bombing, she also was studying politics, she maybe also came from a similar family, she also maybe had similar life experiences, I think if I'm given this type of context, it does 2 things. 1, it humanizes this person because I don't see them as a token. The exact kind of media that you point out is what creates these very tokenistic perceptions that we have of these people. At this point, we need this more nuanced information about these people to even have that humanistic connection with them in the first place. But secondly, when we actually find out more about their life, it means that simply probabilistically, there's more likely for me to find some common point with this person, right? Find something that we both have in common. This says 2 things. 1, it elicits more empathy from me towards that person, but 2, it means I'm more concerned for their cause because I feel that that cause then by extension is also more proximate to me. I think then this is incredibly important for a few reasons. I think 1, people just generally feel more connected to the art. I think this is something the opening doesn't actually explain. But secondly, the understanding of the art you have is more nuanced and anchored. And when you get less tokenistic art, it's also less easy to push away and feel like you in no way are similar to these people, right? Because when I feel like I can like reduce this person to a token and think this is completely devoid of my reality, this is never going to be something that affects me. I think when you have a more nuanced understanding of that person's story, it is much more likely that you actually feel like it could affect. Before I move on, Rob.
No.
Cool. Performance art. OG defines art as like physical visual art too. What we're going to prove is that performance art is uniquely good at individual and social change, and I don't have to explain to you that's inherently identity-based, right? Like, person there, do art, person identity, right? Cool. So, 2 examples. I've already told you about the Marina Abramovich case, but let's look at, for example, PETA. PETA is an animal rights organization. What they do is they literally march women naked in the street with red blood on them to show what the cattle industry does to animals. They march out in the streets and they do this. This is something that 1 meets all of their metrics of, oh, very disruptive, oh, very impactful, people very impressed by this, because it's not just paintings that we are talking about. But how do we think people are likely to react to these kind of things? I think 1, you feel very intense and proximate about these things, as it's not acting, right? It's real people who put themselves into vulnerable situations and actually expose how these systems act in real time. And I think what this means is often you also see it live, so it's more intense. But even if you don't see it live, right, you know that these people aren't acting. It's not a movie. It's not a painting that you could carefully consider. It's something that is showing and exposing the reality of the system that you're criticizing. It shows you empirical evidence of how human nature actually plays out. And also, usually, it's quite easy to interpret because of how intense it is. I think it's also quite effective because it's very provocative. It's disruptive. Means it gets media attention. But often, it even does things that even it's harder for things like governments to ignore when these often involve, for example, physically barricading certain areas. I think when you look a person in the eye who is about to become a victim just to prove the point that this is something worth fighting for, I think this is one of the most emotional reactions you can ever get, which means that A, we fulfill their burden better of showing why this emotional reaction is good. Secondly, your burden better of showing that policy is good. So I think the implication of this then is that we are the team that's actually able to show you very clear delta of the kind of art that I think best fulfills all of the implicit metrics that all of the other teams are talking about. But then secondly, going 1 step lower in the burden that we're taking on, simply explaining to you why protest art is much less likely to be good in and of itself, no matter how much information this person actually ends up sharing or how much of an icon they become long run, because you're simply more likely to relate to it, and the art in and of itself becomes better. For all these reasons, I think this is a clear win for CO. Thank you.
Alright, I thank opposition members for that fine speech, and now invite Governor Whip to conclude the government bench. Here we go.
Boon asks in a POI, why is any of this the tipping point?
I think tipping point analysis misses the boat on what the purpose of art is in society. There is something valuable about participation in art. It is the foundation of culture, since the first humans danced around a campfire and saw the face of God in the smoke, since Enheduanna carved her first poem into a limestone tablet in the state of Sumer. It is about formation of a community identity. It is about things that lead to mobilization, class consciousness, a form of inherent liberation under which you understand that there is a group of individuals who are like you, a group of individuals who face the same oppression that you do, and not one particular individual who is better than you, who comes from a different background, who went abroad to film school or to art school and therefore came back and became your savior. No, it is about seeing yourself in the fire, seeing yourself in the face of God, and having your own community behind you. What is the case from closing government today? Jay tells you a couple of things about what's important about protest art and what its value is. Art is about viscerality and immediacy, as in, the viscerality is the intensity of the things that you see in things like protest art. Because protest art isn't just a film that talks about some kind of oppression. It is things like the Mexican female rights liberation movement painting the statue in the biggest, I can't remember his name, the biggest statue in Mexico, painting it red with blood-colored paint to make it criticizable, to show the harms that are faced by individuals. It is a kind of undeniability that happens when you see these things that are visceral. Secondly, it is an immediacy. It is using stories and signs and symbols that are universal and have been told around campfires forever, signs that can be recognized by people within the group and without the group, who can see themselves in it and therefore can conceptualize themselves in a world immediately without having to read papers and understand academic talk, but can see the forms of oppression that are faced upon them. This is particularly important because oppressed people suffer from dual epistemic injustices. First, they are often unable to describe or understand the pains that they are in because they cannot conceptualize their role in society, so art helps them to understand this. Secondly, it is solidarity. They are often denied the understanding of their plight from the oppressors around them. They don't understand that their life can be different as compared to other individuals who are part of an in-group. So having film that reaches them, that displays their kind of position honestly and that they particularly are willing to engage with, makes them better able to understand this, gives them better consciousness, gives them an inherent liberation. But the key to this is having the art be good in the first place, to represent these things in an honest way. And what Jay tells you is that you only get an honest portrayal of your circumstances when you have the artist be anonymous. Because fear is the greatest defeater of honesty for 3 reasons. First of all, it is a fear of social backlash, that you will be left out of the community that you want to benefit in the first place because you have displayed certain things about yourself that they find untraditional or unacceptable. Secondly, it is the fear of judgment in general, as in you cannot share the deepest, darkest moments of your life when your identity is tied up in it. Third, it is the fear of crackdown from individuals around you, again from the state, but also, this is different from OG because we're talking about why it is an ability to actually represent the art in a better way, not to just not end up dead. In both ways, you are now able to see, this works both ways because the consumer of the art is now able to see the art as about someone like you and not someone's particular story, but a story in general, which enables things like collective acts of art, greater participation in the community, greater community art in general, and a strength in numbers when you see yourself as part of the movement and not someone who is denied it. Note how this defeats closing opposition in particular, because they say you want to have a person who actually represents all these kind of things. You want to have someone who is associated with the art. But we want to focus on the art itself, as in, it's good not to humanize the person. Flipping CO on this point. We want to remove them as much as possible so the individuals who suffer the same things as them can see themselves in the product of the art, can focus on the performances in it, the messages that it is sending, and not on whether or not the individual who has done it is a good person or ought to be representing their community, especially given, as is conceded by every team in this debate, that the individuals who are most likely to produce this art are the ones who are the least proximate to the communities and have oftentimes gone abroad, got training, gone to university, learned Marxist theory or whatever, and came back and brought it to their communities, which means you are less likely to engage with it in the first place and form a class consciousness if it's from these kind of people. No thanks. Weigh this against opening government. Opening government says you face oppressive regimes. The real important thing is to avoid the police state crackdown. This is not, in fact, important because being oppressed and killed happens either way if you are someone from the Gaza Strip, as in the police state already breathes down your neck. It is important to create an identity under which you are willing to risk your life to present art. The more important thing is the more important barrier to the honest production of art is the social ostracization that Jay tells you about. It is about the proximate obligations you feel to your friends and family. They feel that you are taking a part of yourself out and leaving it for judgment when you are not anonymous, which means that people are less likely to participate in general and less likely to participate in broader movements. So we are the team that gets you broader participation. Let's talk about opening opposition. They say you weaponize anonymity. I just think that my POI takes this out, as in it's much easier to discredit a person because there are oftentimes deep racial, historical, and class divides. So you reject a person, but you can see human pain in film or a sculpture. You can see it on screen, especially when you mix things like documentary methods with literary methods, all this kind of stuff, which means that you get more engagement with the art itself when it's not tied up with an individual that's likely to be hated by society. This also takes out CO on the same point, because if you discredit a person, fewer people engage with the art and they don't get their impacts. The next thing OO tells you is that you need money and you can't monetize when you're anonymous. Two responses to this. First of all, this is often guerrilla art, as in it's low budget. It's from impoverished parts of society that doesn't rely on huge amounts of capital. It's camcorders, iPhone films, it's writing that's disseminated on the internet, which means money is less important in this round. But less money actually encourages creativity. It means new methods, combining documentary with fiction, not relying on production studios or publication companies that may be represented by the elites and are funded by them as well. Yes?
So if you're actually so scared of backlash, you make the art for self-exploration and maybe show your closest friend. You can do that on our site too.
But then if you just make it for you and your closest friend, that you don't get any of the benefits of like the social consciousness that we're talking about in our speech, right? Like, it's better to, in general, have more of the art be anonymous, is the point that we're making. Lastly, O tells you that, I guess also we can outright deny that you can't monetize it, as in you can still sell tickets and sell books and stuff, even if the name of the person isn't on it. The last thing to note about opening opposition is the testimonial point, as in, I think I've already beaten that by saying like the people who are least likely to be respected by their local communities are the ones who produce it, as in people who've gone abroad. So, closing opposition. The first challenge that CO gives to us is like, how do you trade this off against Nazis putting swastikas on the walls? I think the first response is like, swastikas aren't really art. Second response is that engagement with the ideas of the oppressed will bite the bullet is like always good. So if some group of society feels oppressed and wants to express themselves in some way, then we're still happy to like trade that off. And the next thing they say is that perception infiltrates your idea of the art. But if perception infiltrates your idea of the art, it probably also infiltrates your perception of the artist too. So if you have the bad ideas that lead you to reject art in closing opposition, you will likewise reject the artists themselves insofar as they are a figurehead of that artistic movement, which means that you never get good engagement with the art on their side of the house. The only way you get members of the political ruling class to engage with it is on the ideas themselves. Why? 3 reasons. They are undeniable, as for instance the example of the Mexican statue. Second, you get international scrutiny when more individuals consume this kind of art. And third, you get political embarrassment in a way that you don't get when individuals are able to deny it by having the individual be focused and not the community that it represents.
Right, I thank the government whip for that fine speech, and now invite the opposition whip to conclude the debate. Here.
Govbench is correct. Protest artists must face down a firing squad before they make their art. But it is precisely when you sing in the face of the firing squad that you compel people to actually listen to your cause, compel people to show that your experiences are so compelling that you would face death to send a message. Without this, the art means nothing and is simply forgotten. The first thing I want to deal with is to explain to us what the contribution for Annamaria was, why it weighs above opening, and why it's very important in the round. I want to note here that to OO's credit, they explain briefly how you cannot separate the message from the messenger. But they don't actually mechanize precisely how integrating the identity into the message changes the way audiences perceive it in a unique and impactful way. That is the contribution of Annamaria's extension. What we explained then is exactly how revealing identity makes protest art truly moving. We explained 2 things. The first thing we explained to you is this idea of performance art, that performance art is inherently inextricable from the individual's identity and is the most compelling, most attention-grabbing way to perform this. Nobody in this debate has responded to this, right? But the second thing we explained to you in Annamaria is we explained to you how knowing the identity of the artist means knowing the context and the experience of the artist. It humanizes them and allows you to actually understand the meaning and the impact of an artist, to know why they created the artwork, what were the traumas, what were the losses that they experienced to compel them to the artwork, what are the experiences that made them stand up in the face of fear and become fearless because it was that truly compelling. This is an important thing for people to feel. because it provides a raw and emotive human story behind the art. A raw and emotive human story that's absent without identity. This is important for two reasons. The first reason, as already pointed out by Annamaria, is that people are particularly time-starved, right? Maybe Rob is intellectual enough to analyze the artwork and stand there and ponder for an hour about it, but most people aren't as smart as Rob, unfortunately. Most people are time-starved, attention-starved, and only listen to compelling, emotive human stories. That's exactly what we provide. But the second reason why it's important is because many people are just not open to rationality. Like perhaps your woke, radical, centrist person would be able to consider that artwork, but many people who don't care about it just wouldn't even bother interrogating it, wouldn't bother interrogating the reason why the artwork's created. They're locked behind their idea of rationality and their preformed political opinions. We uniquely overcome that by providing a raw, emotive human story that nobody can ignore. Only through identity and the stories and traumatic moments connected to the art, uniquely through identity, can we compel an emotional response that overrides the deficit in attention, that overrides the deficit in preformed political opinions that currently prevent protest art from truly being impactful. When you see the art and know how your heart was truly wounded when your kid was killed by a bomb in Gaza, that moves you in a way that is deeply human, that is deeply relatable, that overcomes even the most entrenched like pro-Israeli lobbyists, because they can see, they can feel that art, and they know the art was not easy to produce because the artist had to produce it in the face of fear, in the face of overriding backlash. This extension was important because, firstly, it's probably just more important than the credibility as well as activism pipeline stuff that all proves, because that proves to you that perhaps credibility is important as a fundamental factor, but it proves to you what the actual impact of the artwork that is credible actually is. But the second reason is as to why you should weigh this highly into the round, because it proves to you this is the most exclusive way to overcome the current deficits within social cause, to overcome the current and most pressing barriers that prevent people from changing their minds about things like Gaza. This is the most tight analysis that I've provided probably in quite a while. I think you should credit it quite highly. I think it's just pretty well done. The second thing I want to now respond to CG. They tell us two things. Firstly, on backlash, and secondly, on becoming more relatable. Firstly, on backlash, I have four responses to this. The first response is that many artists, as I've already explained, are so deeply moved and motivated that they are not, in fact, hindered by backlash. In fact, I would propose to you that many artists, in fact, relish the controversy and martyrdom that they gain from becoming an advocate for the society where nobody else does to do so. I think the fear is what makes them fearless. But the second response I have here to the backlash argument is that many artists, as Annamaria rightfully points out, it's not the actual Gazan that's in the Gaza Strip being bombed right now, right? Many of them are diaspora artists, many of them live in the US and UK, and these are the people whose art will get promulgated the most on either side of the house, because these are the people with the most capacity to actually make and distribute art. For these artists, they are still they are largely insulated from many of the harms of safety and backlash that Ghest Bench wants to talk about. But the third response here is actually the flip, which is, as I've already explained earlier on, it is precisely because that person has put their life on the line, precisely because that person has skin in the game when they put their name under that artwork, that makes the art so compelling. Because you know that person has put their life on the line, you know where they come from, you know why it compels them to act in the face of fear. Because you demonstrated your bravery in this particular way, that's what makes people actually pay attention to it. Well, that's what moves people to feel like your human story is worth listening to. That is the most unique element here, and that is the element that's most important to overcome deficits, as already explained earlier on. But last response here is just weighing. Perhaps we get somewhat less art because fewer artists feel vulnerable, there's less diversity in art, etc., etc. We're happy to take this trade-off because it means that the art that is actually produced is actually fully appreciated by the audience, actually moves the needle on social discourse. So we will prioritize quality over quantity. Opening, if you have any. Closing.
I just think you have to respond to the idea that you'll have your perception infiltrated when you produce the art, you will also discredit the individual, which means that engagement goes way down for both the powerful and the less powerful.
Look, if you're an entrenched pro-Israeli lobbyist, you're going to discredit it either way, right? Either you discredit the guy for lying about his kids being killed in Gaza, or you discredit Banksy as being some radical, anti-Semitic fella. So if you're that sort of person, discrediting is probably quite symmetric. I don't think this is the target audience of this particular debate. The second thing I want to respond to from CG is the idea that it's more relatable. First of all, as already alluded to earlier on, having to relate to someone in the complete abstraction requires a lot of intellectual willpower, requires you to actually care about it in the first place. This is much harder to attain and occurs at far smaller scale than the emotive, human, raw response that we explained to you, and so they lose out on scale. But the second response here is that it incurs, I want to say, a pretty grave moral harm, Because you take away the one thing that these oppressed artists have, which is their identity, which is their voice, which is their story, and you would give it to privileged individuals to allow people to make highfalutin intellectual analysis of what this art means. You don't just silence them, you steal their voice and give it away to someone else. I think it's a grave principal harm we cannot be committing, and a principal harm you should credit highly in this debate. I want to weigh on two metrics as CG has done. Firstly, on immediacy and viscerality. We better prove the immediacy and viscerality of it. And again, we are not reliant on the intellectual consumer. We rely on the base consumer, which I think is the most, the person wider at scale. But second is on liberation. To know the name of who is standing up for you, to know they risked it all to stand up for you, to see people being moved by the artwork, finally understanding your cause. That's, I think, the highest feeling of liberation catharsis only achieved on CO.
Alright, I thank Opposition Whip for that fine speech and congratulate everyone for what I thought was